Hi everyone, Russ of Aquarimax here. Today's video is going to be a response to Will in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Will says, "Love your video. Would be awesome if you could do a morning gecko care video for hatchlings and a rough outline of what you do with the babies until they are adults. Side question, do you have any trouble selling the geckos? It seems in no time you can have a lot of geckos on your hands, and I'm not sure if I would be able to sell them all. Thanks a lot. Keep up the great videos. Will." Thank you, Will. I'm going to answer the last part of your comment first. And I haven't had any problem selling the geckos. There's usually a waiting list, but that's a very good thing to think about. It's a responsible attitude to have when you're thinking about getting a pet. But so far, I haven't had a problem, but I can't guarantee that that would be true for everyone. Now, before I even address the first part of your comment, I would love to share the picture that Will sent in. I think this is an amazing picture because these are wild-caught morning geckos, and even fairly tame captive morning geckos, it would be really hard to get them to all sit on your hand like this. So I think this is pretty amazing. I'm not quite sure how Will did it, but I think I'll just think of Will from now on as the Gecko Whisperer. So, now to address your question about how to care for hatchlings. In many ways, hatchlings can be cared for in the same way as adult morning geckos, but there are a few important differences. And those fall into three categories. One is housing, the next is hydration, and finally, feeding. So let's talk about housing first. Well, some people actually opt to keep the geckos in with the adults, the hatchling geckos in with the adults. This can work, but it's always risky in a couple of ways. One, that the adult geckos will sometimes harass, chase, and even eat the hatchling geckos. It can happen. So feeding them enough food can help prevent that from happening, but it's not a guarantee. So you may want to house them separately just for that reason. Another issue is that morning geckos, when they're hatchlings, are extremely tiny and they can wedge themselves into small areas. They will often wedge themselves between the door and the frame of the vivarium, and when you open the door, they will suddenly fall off the door. You didn't realize they were there. As it swings open, they can fall off, or sometimes, and this is worse, they can wedge themselves in that little area, and if you close the door and you don't see that they're there, they can be injured or even killed. So those are two reasons not to keep them with the adults. So what I usually prefer to do is set up a small vivarium for the young geckos where they can grow up for a little while before they're old enough and big enough to be housed with the adults. Now, you can do it as a planted vivarium, just like the one shown here. That works really well. It's a very low maintenance style of vivarium, but you can go much simpler than that. You can just take a deli cup, like this 32-ounce deli cup here, put some paper towels on the bottom as a simple substrate. I like to put a chunk of cork bark in there. It provides a climbing surface, and it also provides hides because there are usually crevices that they can wedge themselves into and so on. So something like this can make a complete vivarium for the geckos for a month or two until they're big enough to go somewhere else. That's about it for housing. Otherwise, very similar to the adults. In terms of hydration, because the geckos are so minuscule when they hatch, they are susceptible to drying out. And so you need to make sure they get enough water, and there are a couple of ways to do this. Fortunately, hatchling geckos, just like the adults, will take droplets of water from a surface such as a glass or a plant leaf, but they will also drink directly from a small dish. So you can provide water in both of these ways. I would say if your geckos are in a planted vivarium, just adding the water that you're normally going to add for the drainage layer and then misting the vivarium daily is usually going to be sufficient. In a deli cup enclosure, on the other hand, you're probably going to need to mist twice daily. You do want there to be a time when the vivarium kind of dries out to some extent. You don't want it to be damp and soggy in there all the time. You don't want the paper towels to be soaked, but you do want the geckos to have a chance to drink from droplets on the side, and the droplets will also increase the ambient humidity in the vivarium for several hours as they dry out. So maybe mist once in the morning and then once in the afternoon, with some time between and afterwards to allow it to dry out somewhat. That should be sufficient to keep the little geckos hydrated. And finally, feeding. Now, feeding the morning geckos is not too challenging, but there are some of the larger insects, such as the hydei fruit flies, that the adults will eat, that these smaller geckos can't really handle when they're first hatched. So I always use the smaller melanogaster fruit flies to feed them as a first food, and I do dust those with a calcium and vitamin supplement. I usually use a Repashy one. I've used Repashy Low D Calcium as well as Repashy Calcium Plus, and those seem to work well. And I can also offer them CGD or Crested Gecko diet. So, various brands will work, but a finely powdered Crested Gecko diet to which water has added to a pretty soupy consistency works well. I have noticed that the geckos shed right after they hatch, and they eat that shed, and then after that they're not interested in food for usually a couple of days or a few days, and then after that they should start eating. And you can offer the fruit flies or the Crested Gecko diet or both, and pretty soon they will start eating, and within a week or two you can usually visibly tell that they've started growing. That's a good sign that they're doing well. They tend to be very hardy, and I've had very few problems with them. And I would say, if you are interested in mourning geckos at all and you haven't seen my care video, if you want some more detailed care information on the species in general, you can check that out. And once again, Will, thanks for your questions. Thanks for watching. I post videos every Friday, all related to keeping aquarium and vivarium pets. You're most welcome to leave a comment and a like, and for those of you who are waiting for an animal voiceover at the end,
hey everybody, watch this. I'm on YouTube.